Maximilian Calypso nervously paced around the drawing room. She was so tense that she didn't even recognize that she was biting her nails until the Duke of Cross came inside. When she heard his cane hitting the floor, Max hurriedly hid her hands behind her back. "Didn't I warn you 1,000 times about that nasty habit?" Sorry. Max bowed her head at her father's cold voice. The Duke clicked his tongue as he looked at the scene. "Don't embarrass me. You've got more luck than you deserve. I won't forgive you if you cause trouble to our family with your dirty behavior." Cold sweat dripped behind her back. She stiffened in fear and opened her mouth with difficulty. "I will do everything that you say, father. I will, as soon as he comes." She could tell what her father's face was without looking up. When she spoke, he always had a disgusted look directed towards her. Max tried to carry on with her words as calmly as she could. "Father, I'll try. This marriage, this." "Stop." The Duke of Cross hit the floor firmly with his cane. "Even for today, but no. Can't you just be calm for a few hours? Who the hell would want a wife like you who stutters like a horse?" Aye. Riftan Calypso is no longer a low-ranking knight. He has become one of the sword masters on the continent, and the bold warrior who has defeated the Red Dragon. If he wants to, the temple will consent to a divorce permit. Just imagining it was horrible, and he breathed loudly, his forehead creasing. For the spirit of the Cross family, you should not be divorced by a knight from the heavens. You can't let the family become a laughingstock because of their stupid daughter. She bit her lips. The objection that it wasn't her fault soared to her throat. She had never wanted to marry Riftan Calypso, and she knew he felt the same way. Wasn't it the Duke himself who pushed ahead with the marriage that no one asked for? Whether he had read her rebellious thoughts or not, her father remained icy. "If you were half as beautiful as Rosetta, no, at the very least as normal. I wouldn't have taken this road to please him." When she remembered her half-sister, whose beauty was comparable to a rose, her arguments faded away like sand. Looking down at her pale, weary face, the Duke of Cross added ruthlessly. "Even if King Reuben wants to welcome him as his son-in-law, he'll be fine even if the other party refuses. It's all because you couldn't win his heart. But, on the wedding, the next day he's gone." She was about to argue it was not about capturing his heart but that she never had the chance to have a proper conversation with him. Before such words could be uttered, Max was struck on the side with the cane, and she crouched with a gasp. She reeled from the immense pain, unable to release a scream. "Don't even think about talking back to me. Just thinking about your horrible habit makes me incensed." She nodded hurriedly for fear of the wood flying a second time. The Duke, who had his lips pressed as if to pour more poison, withdrew at the sound of a knock on the door. The quiet voice of the maid could be heard. "Lord, the Knights of Remdragon have arrived. Guide him to the drawing room." Max looked up at his father in terror. He threatened furiously with his gnashed teeth. "Make it clear to Calypso that you can't annul your marriage. Once again, if you insult the family, you'll pay heavily." Then he went out of the drawing room, leaving behind Max. She stood up with difficulty and leaned back against the window, waiting breathlessly for the pain to pass. The pouring autumn sunlight pierced her eyes in her painful state. Still, she managed to swallow her tears. Her situation never improves even if she cried. Instead, it will only make her look more miserable than she already is. Max clasped her trembling hand tightly. She had to keep her head straight. For a woman in this society, divorce was tantamount to a death sentence. It was not just a matter of being ridiculed, but it was an irrevocable disgrace to the family. To clean up the taint, a man from her family would have to challenge Riftan Calypso to a duel. But her father had no son, and none of his relatives or knights in service could ever hope to match him. After all, who can fight against the swordsman who has defeated a dragon? Eventually, it could only lead to the family's honor being tarnished and her father never, ever forgiving her. Perhaps she would suddenly face death even before the process of the formal divorce would take place. This was her father she was talking about. So somehow. But will he listen to me? She bit her lips, her mood as if she was standing at the tip of a cliff. Their marriage was made solely for the convenience of the Duke of Cross and his knights. 3 years ago, when news spread across the continent that Red Dragon, hibernating in Aranthal, had opened its eyes, El Numa Reuben III ordered his vassals to arms with stringent action. Naturally, the Duke of Cross also had to lead his knights on the expedition. But his father passed on the duty by marrying Riftan Calypse to her. She shivered at the thought of the insulting remarks that the guests had mumbled on the day of the wedding day. The low-ranking knight, Riftan, had to be dragged out of the ceremony as he could not disobey the order of the Duke. The anger and humiliation he would have felt was unthinkable. His expression of restraint was just as fearful. If only I were half as beautiful as Rosetta, maybe he will feel much better and would not think of divorcing me. Ideas drifted in her head in self-derision. Despite his low status, Riftan Calypse was a man with breathtaking features. Even Rosetta, who was mocking him for his origin, blushed at the sight of the knight. Riftan could have enjoyed a lot of romantic relationships with beautiful ladies. Such a man could have escaped having a stutter as his wife. Furthermore, his status was no longer a hindrance. In the event he marries the king's daughter, I won't be able to change his mind even if I begged him. They spent only one night together. The very next day, Riftan left with the army without saying a word of farewell. Even after that, he did not send her a single telegram. She felt doubtful whether he had even regarded her as his wife. As she clasped her face in a dismal mood, a gloomy voice penetrated her ears. What a sight worth seeing! Max looked up in surprise. Since when had a giant man been standing by the door staring at her? My wife trembling, waiting for her husband to come back from the dead. The man walked up slowly, his sarcasm dripping. She looked at him, forgetting even to breathe. Riftan Calypse, wearing a dark blue tunic and silver armor, reminiscent of a monk, looked much larger and overbearing than she had remembered. I didn't expect a warm welcome, but there's no reason to shiver like you've seen the plague. The cold words finally brought Max to her senses. The blood drained from her face at the thought that she had offended him in less than a minute after their reunion. Why you've come, safely, back safely. What should I say? I don't know what to call him. Riftan? It seemed too much of an endearment. Lord Calypse? She thought she'd be laughed at. As she mumbled back her words, she suddenly felt an intense gaze looking at her and took a step back. She couldn't figure out why he was looking at her like that. As if it couldn't get worse, the man's face became colder for some reason. He snatched her arm and uttered harshly. At least pretend to be happy in welcoming me. She froze as their bodies met within a hair's breadth, the smell of leather, horse, and of faint sweat piercing the tip of her nose. His masculine odor flashed across her mind, and a memory that had been buried for 3 years. Mysterious heat blossomed from his hard, penetrating gaze. He looked down at her like one looking at a raw meat, like a hound on the brink of biting its meal. L1 Terrarian 0v3L hosted the first appearance of this chapter at n0vel.b1n. She dropped her eyes in a hurry, her face burning as if she was under the unforgiving heat of the sun. With her heart beating faster with every second, memories of their marriage slowly flooded her thoughts. Her husband was finally back home. How would she deal with him now? Take off your clothes. By the end of the wedding reception, she was led into the bridal chamber by a nanny. With the help of the maids, she washed herself clean and sat on the bed, and after a while her husband followed her into the room. Then he, who was hardened by tension, said so to her. Max didn't know his intentions, but her eyes were wide open. She couldn't understand why the man, who had completely ignored her presence throughout the wedding, had made such a demand out of the blue. She had no specific knowledge, though vaguely aware, that something secret happened between couples. The nanny said, You have to obey your husband unconditionally and accept whatever he asks in silence. How can such unconditional obedience involve taking off her clothes? She was at a loss on what to do, but the man who threw his top over his head gave her a hard look. Do I have to take it off? She took a breath of surprise. Riftan Calypso was like a giant made of twisted steel. His shoulders were twice as wide as hers, his neck was long and thick, and his waist was lean and straight, akin to an elegant hound. She was ridiculous in comparison. She knew at first that he was a man of unique physique among the knights, but it was overwhelming to see him face to face. She swallowed hard. It hurts when his father hit her, what more if he is the one to hit her? You look terrible. His cold voice made Max tremble. The man strode up to the bed and openly stared at her. His huge body, purring golden at the fireplace light, blocked her vision. You don't like me very much, do you? Ah. I. He bent over her. On the face of near perfection, his black eyes held an eerie glow. The man's tight lips twisted with cynicism. Of course, a duke's daughter would never place in her heart a low-ranking knight. There has been an uncontrollable tremor in her body when she heard his voice is full of hostility. A wife belongs to her husband. If he desired, she could be beaten and a harsher corporal punishment was tolerated in her society. Max sweated with fear in the situation where she was forced to cling to his husband's generosity and that at this moment, she might have angered him. Come here. You know what you have to do. Max couldn't urge to ask what she had to do and instead, looked down at her toes. A dark shade fell over her head. The man raised her chin with his long, rough fingers, sending an indecipherable gaze. If we don't do it on the first night, this marriage is considered invalid. Do you want an annulment? Caught in his dark pupils of unknown depth, she shivered. The man twisted his mouth. If you want me to go out, tell me, he said. Once we start, there's no stopping in the middle. Max's throat constricted and she swallowed hard a second time. If she went away like this, her father would surely not forgive her. She had no choice in the first place. Max closed her eyes and loosened her belt with trembling hands. The fear of being beaten by her father was much greater than the fear of being humiliated by a stranger. No. She would not end up being beaten. Perhaps, a more severe punishment would be, her father would even be back with another knight in a few days. She was nothing more than a tool for her father's convenience. In the punctuating silence, Max took off her ornaments one by one and placed them down beside the bed. Only the sound of the fire cackling could be heard through the room. She could feel the man's stinging gaze as she pulled down the strap of her linen dress and pulled her arm out of the sky-high sleeve. The cold night air swept across her naked back and shoulders harshly, making her flesh erupt to goosebumps. She clutched her clothes to her chest, unable to lift them further down. Then the man put one knee on the bed and pulled the hem of her skirt in one motion. And now, wait a second. The hem of the dress flowed down without resistance against Riftan's ominous strength. As she grabbed at the hem of her dress in a hurry, there was a look of irritation in his eyes. Remove your hands. Why, oh, my clothes. She looked up at him with a confused look. The man's face was enveloped in a deep shadow with his back against the fire. Max felt more afraid because she couldn't see his expression in detail. Do you want me to stay or not? Be sure. Max swallowed a sob. Her shoulders shivered as he threw her waistband on the floor without lowering his hands. The cold air swept over her exposed skin. There's no turning back now. His low voice ringing in her ear chilled her heart. He stroked her pale body, stiffened with tension with his warm, calloused hands. As she instinctively tried to push, the man pulled her against him more strongly, wounding one arm around the back of her waist. A strange tingle in the spine and a curious heat were all that came from her body. Just a little bit away? She asked in a trembling voice, but the man didn't even care to hear her. He bowed his head and kissed her breasts. She instantly opened her eyes in shock. The inception of this chapter's publication is linked to N0V3L.B1N. Hot lips swirled over her soft, gentle skin. His strange touch made Max shudder. It was the sight of a grown-up man burying his face in her chest like a newborn baby. Relieve your body. He caressed her stiff, hardened back with a rough palm. His moist breath in contact with her skin gave her goosebumps. He rubbed his rough chin on her soft skin and pushed one hand into the hem of her garment that had been covering her waist. She jumped up. The man's hand touched an area of her that she had never imagined. Her lips quivered with astonishment. What are you? Stay still. If you continue like this, you'll be in pain. Her legs shook in fright. The man, who only exchanged stares with her several times, was now touching her most intimate body part without hesitation. She couldn't believe it. Don't do it. She grasped his thick shoulders and pleaded. Under her touch, she could feel the man's body swaying and trembling. His firm skin was burning under the palms of her hands. It felt as if she was holding an iron heated by fire. Riftan, whose lips were clinging to her skin, soon brushed over her own mouth with renewed vigor. His unfamiliar, rough taste spreading through her mouth made Max's shoulder shake. While she was distracted, he pulled down the hem of her dress and lowered his hand. Her scream was sucked into his mouth. Fuck it. The mixture of her groan and his curse came out from their intertwined lips. She struggled so much like a carp ferociously swimming in water. The deep waters that she dived in was an unfamiliar territory she could not recognize. Her legs thrashed instinctively. But she couldn't get out because she was weighed down by his rock-like body. She felt like a helpless deer struggling with a hound's teeth on her neck. Damn it, I can't wait. He pushed his hand a little deeper, muttering in a nervous voice. Max stopped breathing. The advice of the nanny, who said, "You have to accept everything your husband does as submissively," has long disappeared from her mind. She fluttered like a fish on water under the ministrations of his hand. And an unimaginable sensation shook her whole body. No. Oh. There was no use in struggling to escape. He kissed her furiously and touched her body firmly. Max could only bite the pillow. It was hard to believe that such a bizarre act was actually happening. Her eyes were burning, and her head was spinning. She was ignorant. She doesn't know anything about this. A little, it's going to hurt a little. The movements from his fingers finally halted after some time, to which felt like eternity to Max. In her limp tiredness, she took a long exhale, her rigid body couldn't resist any longer. Riftan took a hold of her clothes and pushing one arm under her waist, lifted it above her head. Their hot bodies made contact. Only then did she realize that his body, as well as hers, was slick with sweat. The man's back glistened gold in the dim lighting. It suddenly occurred to thought that she was sneaking into a blacksmith's forge and saw a golden statue. Would this be the sight when you pour boiling liquid from the furnace over a body? Her thoughts echoed unanswered as her whole body melted, feeling as if it was drowned into a pot of gold. Breathe. Take a long breath. He whispered roughly in her ears, incomprehensible to fully understand in the moment as her back trembled upon his touch on her skin. In an unconscious effort, she spread her legs and clung for life to the man's hard forearms. Then his lower body sank heavily between her parted legs. Ack! The dull pain came before realization of what was happening dawned in. Max struggled fruitlessly with fear as the man trapped her underneath him with their locked lips. She was unable to escape, her heart was crushed against his strong chest as he pushed deeper into her body. She could only cry, raking her fingernails without mercy all over his forearm. Oh, it hurts, she howled. It's because you're too narrow. Tepid sweat trickled down from his neck and fell over her face. As she unconsciously bent her body to get out of the pain, he shivered faintly and firmly grabbed her waist with both hands. Deep wrinkles were set in his forehead as he did so. "Please, stay still," an unexpected plea came from his lips. But Max was only swallowed by the intense agony that racked her body. It hurts, it hurts. Fuck. Don't move, please, ugh. She could feel the man's body shivering and for a moment, she stopped breathing. He hugged her waist, his hold tight on her that she felt she was going to break and began to move as if he could no longer bear it anymore. She groaned at the sharp pain that came. Every time his body shifted, her own body shook like a helpless boat on a raging river. Her mind grew more and more muddy as time ticked by. What are you doing to me? The sheets she clenched with her hands felt as if it were on the verge of tearing. The debut release of this chapter happened at N0V3L_B1N. Oh, fuck. Max couldn't fathom how much time had elapsed before he uttered a strangled moan and drooped over her. He breathed hard under her body, billows of hot steam rising in the process. The man's shoulders still moved erratically as with his heaving. As she noticed all this, a strange sense of loss struck Max. She looked up at the ceiling blankly, her eyelids shaking. What just happened? Why, are you crying? Only after being questioned by the man did Max realize tears were falling from her lids. As she tried to hide her face in a hurry, she felt his moist tongue run over her cheek. She instantly tried to turn her face away. But this only led him to clasp her face and grasp it so that she wouldn't be able to escape him. Don't avoid. An intense, incomprehensible gaze bore to her from his dark eyes, and it made goosebumps erupt on the skin of her back. As he said this, he placed his lips over her temples and cheekbones wet with tears. You're my wife now. Like it or not, there's no turning back. Then he pulled her hair and forced a kiss. Repeatedly, she had to accept helplessly. Time passed without her knowledge. That fateful night, she couldn't count how many times they repeated it. After losing consciousness, she woke up past noon. By then he had already left for the expedition, and the nanny told her that the priest had identified the virgin blood on the bed and announced that their marriage was successful. Such was the rite of passage for marriage. That was all that happened between them. She lost her virginity to him, and he left for the Lexos Mountains on behalf of Duke Cross. Never had it occur to Max that they were a couple. She felt the same on this moment when they finally faced each other after years.